Like what movies did with stage theater and what television series did with serial radio dramas, video games have found ways to emulate the standard narrative devices we know as film and literature. But with a surprise twist. What video games have that these previous emulations could not is a newfound strength that pushes it beyond being simply a reassembly into a new format, and that's the ability to have player choice. In this medium, it is much easier to present scenarios where a player is given options that can directly or indirectly affect the outcome of a given scenario or even the larger story as a whole. We've seen player choice in many games, a few being the classic Fable, the Mass Effect series, Life is Strange, Silent Hill 2, The Witcher 3, and the list goes on and on. But there's a question that comes along from time to time with these choose-your-own-adventure games, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Does player choice in video games limit its storytelling potential? But if you don't know already, you're listening to the Sonuvageek Podcast.
Son of a geek!
I am one of your hosts, Spencer, but all my friends know me as Supreme Lord Commander. And co-hosting with me this morning evening is a man who must have been born on a highway because that's where most accidents happen. It's Zeo. How's it going, Zeo?
Oh my god. Oh, I knew it. All right, that was pretty good.
How you doing,
Did
Zeo?
you talk to my mom? How'd you know?
Spen, it's not where he was born, it's where he was conceived that the accident happened.
And you
No,
can
I
hear
was
the voice.
conceived in a Pizza Hut.
And you can hear the voice of someone else who's joining us today. And don't worry, he's not as bad as people say. He's much, much worse, actually. It's Toll. How's it going, Toll?
It's true. It's really true. I'm good-ish.
Good-ish.
I've been worse.
Oh, well, I'm hopefully by the end of this, you'll be excellent and full of
That depends
energy.
on whether
way
my computer
worse.
decides to stay awake for the entire process.
Well, let's hope it does. So we're here today to talk about choice of players in video games.
Yes.
And how it affects storytelling potential. But there's a question that we've got to tackle first, just so that everybody's on the same page here. And it's, so what do we mean or constitute as player choice? Zeo, you had a really good way of putting this, if you want to start us off.
Well, a lot of games are pretty open-ended, and player's choice kind of exists in almost every game in some facet. But what we're talking about is like specifically dialogue or something that can affect the story narrative down the line, I believe is the debate we're going with. Because it was brought up with Breath of the Wild or like the Dark Souls series, how you can like skip segments of the game or choose to let certain segments happen at certain times. And that's based off of exploration. So I personally wouldn't consider that a player's choice that would affect the story, more so of just an option of what route to take first.
Yeah, it's tough to say because in games like that, it's not a. I don't know if we could consider it a huge effect on story, but it is technically a player choice that has some sort of effect on it. So if any games like that come up, it'll be interesting to see how it goes with that.
I mean, the reason I wouldn't want to consider that, because I mean, Uncharted 4 gives you more choices to handle situations. So like when you go into a fight with a group of people, you can choose to either sneak past them or fight all of them. That's a choice. Is that going to be involved in the discussion? I wouldn't say that really necessarily affects the story.
No, that's a really valid point because in games like that, I wouldn't consider something like that a player choice that affects the story because at the end of the day, you're still going to get to the same end result. Which you could also kind of argue that with Breath of the Wild or something like Dark Souls, but in those games, you don't even have to finish all of it to beat the game. Like you can skip some of it and never actually going to it.
And ultimately, it doesn't affect the game ending either, so I don't think it really changes much.
I kind of disagree.
Because there are different endings based on how far you go. Sorry about that, Tola. I was interrupting you there.
I completely disagree with that because, yeah, these things are open-ended and you have the option of going and doing these things or not doing these things. And the player experience changes on whether or not they go to do these, how they approach everything. In Breath of the Wild, for example, it's completely open, and from the get-go, you can go absolutely everywhere, do everything, get everything. You can beat the final boss without knowing the history of anything, and have a different feeling, a different context at the end of the credits than you do if you go through the entire story. And even if you did that, you could go through in a different order, and the messages will hit you in a different way than it ever did before. You see character relationships built in ways that you maybe didn't consider when you played through it the first time. So the story hits you differently.
We're not talking about like your personal feelings and your interpretation of the game. We're talking about the storytelling elements of the game.
Well, let's try and look at it from this perspective then of... So it's such a large, open and expansive game where it was designed so that players could go absolutely anywhere and decide kind of whatever order they want to go is how the game happens. And because of that, how could that have affected the story? I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that they couldn't have done story-wise because of it being so open. There's not a linear story to follow, not a linear direction. So whatever choice the player makes and how it goes, the game has to be designed so that you can go any direction.
Well, this is why I wanted to define what the debate is, because there's no point of this argument if we're going to run around in circles with it. We have to have some clear agreement in some way. So we have to agree at some point, this is what we're going to debate over, because if we don't agree on something, we're just going to run around in circles. There's player choice in Final Fantasy VII. It's my favorite game ever. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of characters that have their own backstories and optional missions you can do throughout the game. It does not affect the storytelling of the game. Sure, you get more background, but it doesn't affect the narrative the game is telling you, and I don't consider that a part of it.
Okay.
The games I would say would be like dialogue decisions. So like you got the Dragon Age games, you got the Mass Effect games, you have, I believe the Fallout games do that as well. Things like that supposedly, or even the Telltale series that supposedly have a different journey for each person based off of their choices. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I'm at for player's choice. That's what I think of when I hear player's choice. So I just want to know what we can agree on so we can start this debate and have a good side. Because each of us have a side, I believe, right?
Yep.
I would, kind of.
More or less.
All right, Spen, you're always in the middle. But like, for the sake of argument, it's not like 100% our personal views. But I'm going to argue for the side that multiple choices does not make a story better.
And I disagree pretty much completely. Multiple choices tends to make a story better, or at least the user experience.
And I think it's hard to say, because depending on how it's set up and established, it can either take away or add to the experience. But I think I would say in a situation like Breath of the Wilds, I would say it takes away, like, because what's up?
There's no S. There's no S.
So in Breath of the Wild, I think the reason why I think Breath of the Wild is a really good example of player choice limiting storytelling is when you read a book, there's a lot of stuff that gets put into the book where it's like subtle things at the beginning and different character progression and storytelling that you get to experience and see experience and read as you're going along through the book. And a lot of it's able to be done because it's set in a direct path, so certain things can influence others, and there will be specific outcomes that come from it. But when you have a game like Breath of the Wild that is so open and expansive, you don't get to have those same kind of situations set up because you can go any direction. They can't decide, okay, I want this at the beginning of the game, you're going to interact with these characters, and because of that, it's going to have an influence with these characters later on that's going to set you up for this great situation over here. You don't really get that kind of opportunity as much as you could have in Breath of the Wild because they have to take into account, okay, we don't know where this player's going. He or she needs to be able to have the same kind of experience at the end of the game, no matter what direction they've gone with it. So a lot of those connections or different story or plot-driven points can't really be placed into it and are removed because you need to be able to go to any point at any given time and still be able to progress along.
Okay, and this is where I'm saying it's not a part of the debate because it's not a player choice of changing the narrative. You're just choosing what section to explore first, and you can miss things, you can skip things. That's why I'm saying we need to have a clear defining
I'm actually
ground.
on Zeo's side for this one. Okay. Breath of the Wild's too open really to discuss in this because each section has a linear story and you can bypass certain sections, and ultimately the whole thing is about the hero's journey and the player gets their own unique experience with it. But ultimately there's not really much freedom of choice. It's just a matter of how many tools and hearts and weapons you have at the final boss. So that game I don't think really fits this debate.
All right, no, I definitely see where you guys are coming from. I still slightly agree with you guys, but I think with limiting that kind of stuff does make the debate a little easier and something that we can actually come to a potentially concrete resolution at the end.
So
we can cut the last 15 minutes.
Right. Well, I mean, the baseline then. So are we able to agree that for the sake of this debate, we're going to talk about, my assumption would be like dialogue decisions or actions you have to make that change the narrative.
I think that's a really fair way to go with it then.
Okay.
Okay. So that is my interpretation of player choice.
No, I think that is a very fair interpretation that we can use for the sake of the debate.
So for my opinions, then I think that's why it would make a narrative weaker. Now, who would like to go first at this point is the real question.
Well, honestly, the best example I have in favor of choice improving the story is No Man's Sky.
Interesting.
Which everyone who watches our channel already knows about. We make machinima with it.
Oh, good plug. Next to nothing. Watch it.
Next to nothing. Watch it. The thing about No Man's Sky is no matter how many times you play it, the story is going to be the same. From point A to point B to point B to point C, the narrative is the same. But the way you move through the narrative, the places you go, the things you experience, the emergent gameplay that comes your way, gives you a different interpretation of the lore as you discover it, depending on whether or not you learn certain words, visit certain areas, meet certain creatures and learn about their cultures as you go through. You could learn some of the story or you could miss out depending on how much you explore, what you choose to do.
Now,
does that affect the narrative?
To a certain degree, yes, because I played through.
Change the ending?
Unfortunately, I think this one kind of falls into the same category as
this
Breath
is
of the
basically
Wilds.
Breath of the Wild. Yeah, it's you're
it's
making choices to expand the lore. That doesn't change the narrative of the game.
Yeah.
The narrative has choices, and you can go through and make different choices each time, and it gives you different results, different branching paths in the narrative. And every time it branches, depending on the path you took, you get another new interpretation. So the player experience is broadened because of the breadth of the scope of the game.
So anybody that's played Next to Nothing then is going to be able to look at this and be like, wow, Spen and Zeo are making all of this stuff with Toll in Next to Nothing, but they've never actually played the main game, have they?
No, we haven't. So my question is, is this game basically a Telltale game where you have different branching storylines, but you have the same ending, essentially?
It's got dozens of storylines, and you can choose which way to go, and none of them are dependent on the others. You could play forever and never touch one of them.
But does it all end the same way?
In each one, they have branching paths, different way that you can go through the narrative. In the very first choice that you're given is, do you want to follow the path of Atlas or do you want to ignore it and explore freely? And if you choose to follow the path of Atlas, then you get sent on a quest to go find these space stations and learn about the history of the machine, assuming you learn the language, or you can just completely ignore it, go off this way. And then in that case, you get contacted by a couple of explorers who are trying to help you understand the secret of the universe. And then you can choose to follow their way or go off on your own and ignore them and just explore the universe at your whim and find your own personal narrative based on what's scattered throughout the worlds.
But does the ending change based off of any choice you make?
There's no ending. Each story has a conclusion, but the game ultimately doesn't have an ending until the player decides they're done with it.
Interesting. So I think in this situation then, Zeo, we've got to ask the question of, for the player choice, does it matter if the player choice affects the very ending of the game, or is it...
It's not necessarily that it has to have a different ending, but the argument is, does it affect the narrative? You know, and does it make narrative better or worse? That's the argument. So knowing it has an ending, like a game like this is so open-ended, it's basically a big sandbox with a bunch of lore. I don't consider it a narrative. I don't consider there being an ending. If there's no real ending until the player's done, that's just exploration.
Well, I mean that in the sense of like Skyrim, there's no real ending until the player's done, but each quest line has a conclusion. And yes, the conclusion does shift based on the choices that you make.
But Skyrim does have ending. There's a main story you play, and it has a conclusive ending to the story.
Well, technically, No Man's Sky does have a conclusive ending as well. When you get to the ending, you restart the game.
That is the question. Does it change the ending? Or is it the same for everybody?
You have the option at the end to reload into another universe and explore another galaxy and explore a different path, or stay where you are and keep searching for whatever you want to find in the current place.
So that sounds like the same.
Well, so let's look
in
at
the limited definition, yes.
Okay. So the point I'm trying to make then is like, it's not really a narrative. You're just choosing branches to take to get to the same conclusion. To me, that's not a narrative. A narrative is a story from point A to point B. There's an arc, you have characters, you have build up. You know how story structure works.
Mm-hmm.
does it?
And I think the
make
story
it,
in No Man's Sky is very well constructed, very well structured. I don't think arguing this one with you is very productive because neither of you have played it, so you don't even know what I'm talking about.
I don't, but I understand the concept of exploration, choosing different paths, and I get the idea of like, hey, you can go down this route. You talk to this guy. This guy has his own story that you go through, but like the reason it makes it for me that doesn't seem better is because like. In my head, what's the point? You know, and I see like exploration, the game as exploration. I see that that's the purpose of the game. That is it. But I don't think it's the narrative that really carries you through the game. I think it's the interest and the intrigue of discovering new things and expanding.
Yeah, but what we've got to look at here, though, is not like we've got to basically ignore the exploration part of No Man's Sky and look at it from these moments in the game where you are following a quest line or a storyline where you're given choices. With you having the choice at that moment, does it does it make the game better? Does it make it more enjoyable, or is it really the same? Like,
okay, now that we've narrowed down the field here, I can tell you honestly that my first time playing through the main storyline, there were branches at every point, and I kept wondering, could I have done this differently? Would it have turned out better if I'd made the other decision? Would I be doing something else right now if I'd made the other decision? And on subsequent playthroughs, I went back and yes, it did change. It might have been a minor change, but it was enough to make my experience of the narrative as it was presented completely altered from what it was before.
Oh, okay.
But it's altered better.
Better depends. It's kind of an emotional thing, more gray areas. You know, are you a dick to this guy or are you friendly with them? Do you do the right thing or do you do the greedy thing? And that affects how they interact with you later on and really makes you regret some decisions or appreciate the potential that you had for screwing up before. And it's like, oh, I'm glad I made that decision. And in the end, in one storyline, there were at least 8 different places where it definitely branched off. And I still am not entirely certain how I could have done it better, but I know it could be done.
But in this situation, do you feel that if it wasn't, if there were player choice, like if you didn't have player choices and you went through and the developers had the ability to go through and look at everything that was going with the story and say, okay, everything that's going along with the lore-wise, this is how, if we lay it out this specific way, we'll be able to give them the best experience possible with the most interesting interactions, the most relevant lore, all of these different things. If we lay it out in this perfect path for them, they'll be able to experience it this way. Do you think if there was a specific path that they had set up that they felt was the best option with all the knowledge they had about the game, could your experience have been better if it was laid out that way for you?
In this particular game, I'd have to say no, just because the exploration and the wonder of discovery is a key part of it.
See, but with this kind of discussion,
you don't
we've
know
got
the history of your character.
Yeah, the tough part, though, is in this discussion, we've got to look away from the actual exploration elements, and we're just looking at the player choice elements of the game.
Right. So
I'm acknowledging exploration as part of the narrative. I'm not saying anything else about it. Exploration is a core part of the narrative.
Let me say something here. I have a couple questions and I want to know. So, like, have you had a moment where something was mundane and you maybe changed the game? Like, you may have restarted your story just to have something different. Or maybe you just didn't like the path you're going.
Yes.
Okay. Does that not make the game weaker then because it has that option to just be blah?
I don't think so. Because it also has the option to be great. I made the mistake in not going out and discovering enough to understand what's going on.
But if that was an option, could you just say that it was just great? You allowed the capability to say that, yeah, there is a mundane version, a garbage version way to play this. That shouldn't be an option, I think. I mean, that hurts a narrative. Why would you allow a narrative to just end in a bad way? I mean, there's a difference between evil and good, or like you take a path of darkness and light, or your choice destroys this city or it saves this other city. But like, if there is just a version of a path, like in Skyrim, per se, let's say you can just choose a path to just be a guy and I don't know, you get married, you have kids, and then you just become an alcoholic.
Yeah,
that would be fun, but does that make
a viable option in there?
Right, but does that make the narrative of the story better? No, it's just a garbage story. Like, it's something someone would do for fun, sure, but like it doesn't make the game itself better on a narrative standpoint.
But the fact that you can play the game in that way, you have the option to do so. You can make that choice, and it can be an enjoyable one and a personally rewarding one is astounding.
So, in a sense, you could say that the fact that there are these different options, the game gave you a good, strong sense of replayability. And because of you being able to experience it different ways, you found that the narrative kind of spoke out stronger for you because of the being able to experience it different ways and see it from different angles.
Yeah. And, a big part of the choice is not necessarily what the narrative the developers had intended from the get-go. Some of it is emergent gameplay, bits of story or lore that comes out as a result of things that happen in the gaming environment as opposed to narrative that you're spoon-fed.
Okay, so then allow me to give my example of why I think it's weaker. You're trying to create such a big, wide story that you tend to not pay attention to other things. So one of the things that why I don't like games like Mass Effect or Skyrim or Dragon Age Inquisition is one, there's exceptions, but a lot of characters start, you have amnesia, or you're brand new, or like you're chosen one by the gods or something like that. And the acting is pretty stiff because you have so many character models you got to make. You have the voice acting is pretty meh because everybody has to have 1,001 lines for every 30 minutes of gameplay because you have to make so many choices, as opposed to a game like I would use as the best example, the Uncharted series, or even The Last of Us from Naughty Dog. They have a single narrative, linear driven story. You can expand on their lore and everything by getting collectibles, maybe looking around, but they have one narrative. And in that narrative, you get so much more rich backstory, more rich character development, and a much better story because they get to create this world around you and you get to experience, as opposed to you having the option to just go and dick around. I mean, I can see that being fun, but on a storytelling standpoint, I don't think any of those games are better than The Last of Us or even Uncharted.
No,
well, in that case, I think we have to consider developer intent.
Because what's tough is when you make such large, expansive games, your resources kind of get divided out and amongst to work on all these different things. Whereas games like the Uncharted or The Last of Us, which are really good examples for what you're talking about, Zeo.
Fantastic games.
Yeah, because there's the linear story. There's no player choice. You're following along. You're playing. Essentially, you're kind of playing a movie, and because you don't have this expansive world where they're spending time populating it, they really get to focus in on the actual story elements of the game, and everything that you go through in those games is relevant and is character building and helps grow the whole story as a whole. And the games are only able to be that way because there is no player. There's no player choice. Everything is the set story that they get to build and say, this is how we feel the best experience is going to be. Which
is why I would consider the narrative stronger and the story structure better, just because like when you talk about Skyrim, when you even talk about No Man's Sky, as Toll would say, he talks about the exploration, the looking up the lore, following this path, but he never once mentioned characters. He never once mentioned
I didn't mention the characters because I don't want to spoil it. It's a really emotional story.
He doesn't. You don't mention the arc or the path, the choose. Like no one talks about those games a whole lot. I mean, there's a few characters here and there. Like you got The Witcher, who does a great job at nailing multiple choice, but they put way more time into it than other developers. And there's exceptions to every rule. So The Witcher, is the best counter argument against me, I would say. However, for the other games, I don't think they're strong. I mean, Mass Effect is a prime example of why it's bad. You have all these great choices that lead you through 3 games, and then it all ends with what color do you want? I mean, to me that disappointed fans left
very
and
much
right.
Disagree with you on that one. Yes, the ending fell flat. Yes, but that game, that trilogy was not about the ending. I will say right now, the first game sucked outright, but it's not about the ending. It's about the player's personal journey.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts in that game that wouldn't be the same if we didn't have to make choices. Like I brought it up on a podcast
you can
before.
Exterminate the synths, you can save the synths, you can ally with them, you can exterminate entire races or save entire civilizations, you can raise lost civilizations from the depths of time. I think that's in one of the DLCs. There's so many options for exploration and discovery and unique player choices that, yes, the ending kind of falls flat, but that game is not about the ending. It's about the journey.
The tough part here, though, is in those games, the only times the options would feel actually relevant or important, though, is if you were emotionally invested in the moment or in the game. So if someone wasn't emotionally invested in it, the options wouldn't mean very much. And a great example of that, I talked about it on a previous podcast, is there's in the very first Mass Effect game, the first time you're actually supposed to make a decision, you have two party members that are with you, that you have a part of your team, and you have to decide which one of them comes with you and which one goes and sets off some sort of device so that you can escape and get out of there. And that was the very first time in any game that I felt that player choice had a huge effect on me, because those were my two favorite characters at the time, and I had to decide which one was going to go and die and which one I was going to save. And because I was so emotionally invested in them, it made the player choice there absolutely just super impactful. And I don't think that even like just that moment alone and several other throughout the game, they wouldn't have been the same if I wasn't so attached to it.
Riding off of that, I played the first Mass Effect, I played the second Mass Effect. I had that same choice. I don't remember the alien name, I don't remember his name, but I had the female in my party the entire time, never had him. So it was easy for me to kill him, and I was unaffected. That kind of thing didn't affect me, but see, where I think, I thought it could just be much stronger if you had both of them in your party and then you had to lose one. So my example of where a narrative would be better without player choices, I'm going to use my favorite game as the example. Aerith. Spoilers, by the way.
Never heard of it.
Okay. Aerith dies in the game.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
That's not the name of the game. Final Fantasy VII, people.
Yeah, Final Fantasy VII. Aerith. She dies. If you had a choice to actually save her, I felt like it would really hurt the narrative. Mm-hmm. It was so necessary, but and everyone wanted to save her. Everyone looked for ways to try to save her. But if you actually could, I don't think the game would be as strong as it was, because that was such an impactful moment to take away from me. Because I had her in the party, or even without having her in the party, she's just integral to the story. And then that was a big loss on your team. It was very emotional, very impactful. But if I got to choose a path where I could maybe sacrifice another player or another character instead, I don't think it would work out as well, because then you have too many variables that could change it.
Mm-hmm. All right, then let me backpedal to Mass Effect. Mass Effect 3. There's a point where you have the option to exterminate the entire Krogan race. There's a character that you don't have to recruit, but if you recruit him onto your ship, at that point, if you've talked with him enough, you can have him sacrifice himself in order to spread the cure through the atmosphere and save those people. And if you've gone everywhere, you've talked to everyone, you've learned enough to feel that connection with them. I actually cried at that part, because I didn't want to lose that guy, but I also didn't want to be responsible for genocide.
But you got that option. What about people who didn't get that option? What about people who got a more mediocre option? Your narrative is better because you got to get there because you had the luck of the draw. My narrative is better because
of the choices I made. So choice has the potential to improve your story, yes, and choice has the potential to make it fall flat. That comes down to the player. The question here isn't whether or not choices will make it worse. It's, can choices make it better? And I'm saying yes, they can.
See, that's why I'm thinking it's from my perspective, that's why I find it to be very situational with all of this, just because there are times player choice. There are times where it's going to make the narrative better. And there's some games that I think are a million times better because there is no player choice. But there's other games where because there was player choice in it, it's made it more special to me. And it's those moments that I remember in games, years down the road. So that's why I think it's kind of tough to really decide or to have one decision kind of say like whether it's better or worse, because it's all situational. It depends on how it's implemented, where it's implemented, and how attached you are to the moment that's going on and its potential consequences.
Now, I will say, your Final Fantasy, The Last of Us, Uncharted, yes, they're linear, and I hold them all in high esteem, but they are on the same level with me as Mass Effect.
That's fair. I don't hold Mass Effect on the same level as them because I don't feel like... I mean, you have writing and character backstory that, yeah, they expand upon all of those, but for me, personally, it's hard to get into it when, you know, it's very dry, very stiff, like when everything comes to a stop when you have dialogue choices. And for me, that takes you out of the game. You know, I get sucked into the story, I get sucked into the narrative, and it's easy when it continues because then you're getting shoved into it with them. But then when you have to have a point to where, oh, should you sacrifice him or this person? And then they give you 45 seconds to choose. You don't have that luxury in a real story. You know, they don't add a real precedence.
No, that's fair.
It feels like it halts. It brings it to a standstill, and then you take yourself out of it. And then you have to debate with yourself, oh, what should I do? And then you can strategically decide. Or you can start your game over. I have one friend who is the prime example of why I dislike multiple choice. He will literally play a game. He'll spend 5-6 hours creating his character. He'll play a game. He'll make one decision that affects really not much of anything. A restart just so he can do something else. And that hurts the story because he bitches about it. He bitches the fact that he did that. He complains. But he did it.
That sounds to me like the problem's less with the game and more with the player.
Well, I mean, you could say that about other things, like when you have loot boxes in Star Wars, that's the problem with the player who gets addicted to buying a bunch of loot boxes so he can unlock a certain thing and spends money.
Well, I don't think that really fits the argument because loot boxes are just another form of gambling that hasn't been banned yet.
All right, let's move away from the loot boxes stuff. I think that's a little...
The point I'm making with that is it's not the player. It's not that circumstance. It's the situation because you're creating that capability. Like when... it might be different too if like these games create a multiple choice and you can't reset. You know, you have to finish the game before you can change.
Okay.
Just because then it forces you. I would say like, and I hate bringing up examples against myself, but like games with like Heavy Rain or with like Detroit Become Human, the more recent one that Quantic Dream has done, those allow multiple choices with various different endings, and each of them feel like they have a very strong narrative in some way or form.
Well, they didn't gel with a lot of people because they're not exactly games so much as interactive movies.
See, but that's because the game is designed and built around player choice.
Right. So like you're going to tell me that's not a better game because of it? I mean,
I enjoyed the story. I think it's a terrible game. All of the above games.
Well, then how can you say multiple choice makes games better if you think that the epitome of multiple choice is literally that game and it made the game worse?
The question that we started with was, can it improve the narrative? And Heavy Rain, yes, it improves the narrative. Same with Fahrenheit, same with Detroit Become Human. The choices improve the narrative by giving you so many different ways to experience the story and come to an ending. The narrative is improved.
I think Zeo's bringing up some really good points. And I want to agree with both of you because there's elements of both player choice and not player choice that kind of makes... here, I'll give you guys an example here. A game I am absolutely in love with right now is Life is Strange. And it's a game that's centered around the idea of player choice. There's many, many moments throughout the game where I make a decision and I don't know what all the consequences are going to be for the decisions yet, but decisions I make affect the outcome of each episode and then eventually the end of the story. And there's a feature in Life is Strange where you can rewind time. So I can make a decision and then I can see that a thing comes up on the top of the screen that just says this option is going to have consequences. And what I can decide to do at that point then is I can hold down one of the buttons and I can start to rewind time so that I can make a different decision. I mean, that's not the sole purpose of the rewind time. Like the rewind time is also in there so that I can break into like there's a moment where I break into a guy's room and I can go around, search a bunch of different things, look for some stuff, and then when I'm done I can just leave. Or what I can
Yes.
do is once I've broken in, I can rewind time to go and have it so that my character's in the room, but it's as if she never actually broke in through the door. So that now I've made a choice there to hide myself or hide the fact that I've broken into the room. And I mean, in moments like that, I find that player choice has really elevated the story, and it's made it more exciting because now I've been able to go and change the outcome and potentially save myself from some different harrowing moments. But there's also moments in the game where this player choice makes the game worse. And it's the fact that I can go back and rewind time and pick a different option. So, because there's been moments where early on in the game where I would go make an option and I'm like, I don't know if this is actually a good idea. The notification will come up and say that I've now made a choice that's going to have consequences. So for the first little bit, I would be like, oh crap, I don't know if this is the option that I want. I would rewind time and I'd go and look at what the other option is. And in those moments, it's taken away from the narrative, because now I've made an option that's, who knows what's going to happen. It could lead to something interesting or exciting, but I can now go back and look at the other option, and it takes away from the thrill and the excitement and kind of what's going on with the game. So it's tough to say, because there's moments where the choice has really helped make the game stronger, but there's other moments where it's taken away. The only other really good example I can give of where player choice has really influenced the game in an exciting way is there's a character in the game. She's my absolute favorite, and I'm trying to do everything I can to help her and make things better for her in the game. And through a lot of this has been through some different decisions until a moment came up where I basically had to try and save her life. If I was going, there was a short series of events that I was in the middle of doing to save her life, and if I failed, she would die, and then I'd have to go through the rest of the game with my favorite character dead. And the whole time up until here, I've had player choice. I can go back and rewind time. I can make different options to make sure that things are going. But at this moment here, it's now taken away my player choice. Something has happened that stopped my ability to rewind time. So now all of these moments where I was able to rewind time and make things better, it makes this moment of not being able to do that and know that if I screw up, she's going to die, that much more dramatic. And I think the setup of the player choice beforehand made that moment so much more emotional and powerful for me.
Right. It gives you a profound feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah, and if I didn't have the player choice in that game, that moment there wouldn't have been as powerful as strong. But there are other moments previous in the game where, because I had the ability to choose different options and go back and rechange them, it made it worse for me. So I've actually started playing the game where when I make a decision, I stick with it because it's more thrilling and exciting for me. And so it's kind of tough for me to decide if the player choice is actually good or not, because with me being able to make these different decisions that influence the story on this game I love and all these characters that are just so interesting and it's exciting to me, like the choices that I make that influence make things or make different options different is fantastic. And it's just, I don't know, I think Life is Strange wouldn't be as powerful of a game if it didn't have player choice, but there are moments in the game that aren't as powerful because there is player choice. It's hard to it's hard to explain, but
I've got two games in mind right now, one of which supports what I've been saying about player choice being so very good for a story, and another one, which is its sequel, which firmly outlines that a lack of choice can make a really good story as well. I'm talking about Undertale and Deltarune.
Okay.
Everyone knows about Undertale now. You can play through it completely peacefully, never kill a single enemy, and get an amazingly rewarding ending. Or you can play it and you can kill whatever happens to come your way and get another really fun ending. Or you can go full-on genocide route, hunt down every single monster in the game, and get a 100% completely different story that is much more challenging, far more difficult to complete, and it haunts you on subsequent playthroughs because of the choices you made in that one time you decided to go genocide. You're haunted by demons any other time you complete the game. But so that makes that game's narrative way better because there's so many different ways to experience it, and they're all profoundly different from each other. But counter to that, its sequel, Deltarune, it fully supports Zeo's stance. You know, Deltarune gives you the illusion of choice, but every choice you make is snatched out of your hands. You are pushed down this single narrative path, and it's still a really good, engaging narrative that draws you in all the way from start to finish, and it jerks at the heartstrings, and it rips apart your emotions. From the same person, in the same universe, no choices, no freedom of choice anyway for the player, and it's still a really powerful narrative. So, I mean, the whole point I'm trying to make is player choice in a narrative has the potential to make a narrative better, but it's not necessary for a good narrative.
Okay.
As potential. Potential is the key word for me to push my argument home, I would say, just because the potential to make it better still leaves the capabilities to allow it to be worse.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And with that, I want to enjoy my games. I want to enjoy every aspect of a game I play. I want to enjoy the entire story, for better or for worse. If it's going to tell me a bad story, or bad is not the word I'm looking for, if it's going to tell me a terrible story in the sense of dread and stuff, like The Last of Us, I would say, then I want to be taken down that path. I want to be taken down that. If it takes me down a joyous story of just happiness, I want to be taken down that path. I don't want to go through the possibility of being in the middle ground of just meh, nothing happening. I cannot think of the name of the game. But there was this indie game I played, and it had 3 options, essentially, 3 choices. You could have a good ending, a bad ending, and then you can just have a neutral ending. And they had a percentage. It was their PlayStation trophies. The percentages of people that got the neutral ending was like 80%. It was much higher than to get a good ending or even a bad ending. But the good and bad ending are both just better stories. However, most people got the neutral ending, which is just kind of, it was meh. So like the game is like you wake up in this darkness of the world that's in this dying or something. It kind of reminded me of Resident Evil, and there are like these creatures and monsters hanging around that have killed everything, and you have to just try to survive.
Is it The Darkness?
And then no, I can't remember the name. It's like called something the director. I can't remember.
Oh, we'll look it up after the podcast, and we'll throw it in the comments. Or
yeah, we'll have to look it up in the
below.
podcast and throw it
That
in.
way people can look at it and try to find the good endings.
Yeah, but like you could take a path and you could like
Support the
you go through
indie
this whole
developers.
story, and you can make certain choices. You can help certain characters. You can use certain items for yourself or give them to other people. And like there's an ending to where like it turned out you're just dying and looking at a sunset, and it was just dreaming all of that. And then the neutral ending is just you wake up in a hospital. That's it. Like it was just all part of the hallucination or whatever, and like you're just a crazy person. And the bad ending was just something else. I never got to finish it, but I read that it was just better. Like so, like creating that option to just have a bad ending, and not bad and necessarily like just like the bad route, but bad in the sense of like it's just not enjoyable. That makes the game worse. Like why
Almost
would you
like a punishing ending.
Yeah, why would you create that to be an option? Like why would you allow players to waste 40 hours into a game, 60 hours into a game, however many hours it takes to finish this, and just get something unsatisfactory?
No, that's fair.
I'd be honest. If I got an ending like that, like what you described, after investing all that time in the characters, I would actually be motivated to play through again and see what can I do better.
Interesting.
But that's just me.
But does that make the game better? Does that make the narrative better? I don't think
Not
so.
usually, no.
Right. So like that's what I'm saying. Like you can make better choices to potentially have a better ending, but I don't think it makes a narrative of a game. I don't think it makes the game itself better in any way. I think it just creates more so you can trick people into saying, "Oh, we have multiple choices."
So what would your stance then be on Infamous games? Because we talked in one of the podcasts about Infamous, and you mentioned about how there were different choices and options that you got to make in the game, and that you felt I think you said that most of the options in the game that you were still kind of fairly meh about. But how is your stance on that game then with multiple choices?
So I love the Infamous series. It's one of my actually favorite series of all times. I love Infamous 1 and 2. Infamous 1 ends, and based off of your ending, if you're good or bad, the second game starts different and even ends wildly different, more different if you continue down that path. That's what's great about it. But at the same time, what I disliked, so like every choice, you got a good ending and a bad ending. So like there were two narratives specifically. You had choices to choose one or the other narrative, essentially. I mean, that's considered multiple choice, yeah, but it's also a linear decide which side you want to be on.
And my favorite part of the game in every Infamous game ever is going to a random pedestrian and just knocking them down and then reviving them. I'd stand there for like 10 minutes at a time. Die! Now, live!
Yep. But, like, and I love those games, and I think both sides of the story were interesting and good, but I felt like they could have improved one over the other if they focused on it, because ultimately, how that game worked is they played Infamous 1, and then when Infamous 2 came out, a lot of people had questions like, how would we start the second game if we did the bad ending or the good ending? Their answer was, whatever percentage, like they look at the trophy list essentially, and whoever had more trophies for a good ending or a bad ending, that would be the route of how they would want the game to start for Infamous 2.
Oh,
so
that's
even with multiple choice, they still already chose a route. Like, and more people, there was like a 65% that had the good ending versus the 35 who had a bad ending trophy first.
Oh, okay.
And so they went with the good ending to start Infamous 2. And so basically, like, it was intended to start off as a good guy. Why? Why allow that option then if you're just gonna turn around and you have your set narrative anyways? Like the Mass Effect games, even going back to them is like, yeah, you have these options to be whoever you want, but they already have a story set and plan. They have a main narrative that would be the most ideal story for you. Why not just give you that story right out the bat?
See, I think in that example right there is the perfect one to argue in your favor then, Zeo, because it just shows that the developers even admitted it. Basically, when they started to make the game, they're like, all right, we're going to be able to do this a lot easier and a lot better if we have if we start with one of the endings. Because if they'd started with both of them, then they would have had to divide their attention onto both. And we maybe, who knows, maybe both of the way, if they did it that way where you could start the game two different ways, maybe both of the ways could have been good. But there's also a chance that because of that, you wouldn't have had as good of Infamous 2 as you did.
So, I mean, it's the point I'm trying to make is like a lot of these game developers, when they create these multiple choices, they typically already have a narrative in mind. Just give us that narrative, enrich that narrative itself as opposed to giving us the choices. I don't think it makes the game better because you give those choices. I just think you're allowing people to create replayability, which replayability is involved in gameplay and stuff. And I'm not hating on it. I understand why it exists. It's just, if you wanted just a great story, give us the great story. You know, give us the story you had in mind as opposed to trying to make us feel like we have choices to give us lesser than stories. You know, and every game they call the better ending the true ending. That they call it the true ending.
Mm-hmm.
Like how many times have you looked at an achievement list or a trophy list and you got true ending trophy or achievement?
There's a lot of games that do that. So if you manage to get everything that they want you to get done, then you get the true ending. You know, Zeo, this is going to be the first time I say this, but you not 100%. But you've managed to sway me more in looking at it from your perspective now. Where
I'll concede Z makes some good arguments, but there's also lots of stories that don't have choices. Let's see, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Tomb Raider. Well, no, Tomb Raider is a good story anyway, but
well, what's tough though is that they're a bad
not good
story.
Stories.
You're right; they're not good stories, but player choice didn't have an influence on that, so that's unfortunately not kind of within the parameters of what our debate is looking at.
He's asking if choice makes a story better. I'm saying a lack of choice can definitely make it worse.
I don't know. I don't think it has the same kind of connotations. Like if a lack of choice, I think if a story was bad with a lack of choice, then even if there were choices in it, the story still would have been bad, because that comes down to the people writing the story.
Right.
Well, everything comes down to the people writing the story. I was just saying, if you're going to consider one way, you might as well consider the other. But I'm not prepared to argue that stance right now. It just occurred to me.
Okay. 'Cause I don't know, I still think like there's some games that I still firmly believe that that I wouldn't have enjoyed them as much if I had if it was a linear story. That being said, I think if it was a linear story, then it would have been a lot easier. And I think for them to kind of expand on story more and make it a lot more solid of a foundation. So if we look at it specifically from does player choice in video games limit its storytelling potential? I'm going to say the storytelling potential, it definitely does limit it. But my counterpoint, so I can still kind of stay in the middle, is there are some games that I have enjoyed more because of the player choice, and it's allowed me to get invested in it more.
I will say games like Dragon Age and things with expansive choices like that, I don't know which way to go. I can't make heads or tails of it, and I fall out of the narrative. It definitely can make it weaker.
And that's the thing. Like, you have to get sucked into your own little pocket of the narrative to fully appreciate it. When there's too much, you can get overwhelmed, or like you just don't care enough. Like, I want to be thrusted into a story. Like, imagine those games. Imagine Dragon Age or Mass Effect even. If you just had a single narrative, but you had an expansive world to explore. Like, you had optional stories to explore, things like that, but it doesn't affect the main narrative itself. Do you think that could be better? Do you think Mass Effect could be better if you were given this type of narrative and you had these characters that you were able to grow with, and then the choices those characters made in the narrative affected the story?
Well, in Mass Effect, that does happen.
I'm gonna say yes. I think it would have been a better story, but I wouldn't have been as emotionally invested in it.
Okay, that's fair. Because the way I'm trying to think about it is like, if Dragon Age or Mass Effect was built in the way like Final Fantasy VII, I'm going to go back to that for my example, is like there's one narrative you follow, but you have all these different stories within it that you can choose. However, they don't affect the outcome of the singular narrative. You can either follow the entire singular narrative, or if you want, you can take time to do these. That's not considered player's choice. That's just exploring and then getting more of the backstory of the world. I think creating something like that would be much better for those types of series, as opposed to allowing you to have character creation, then player choice, which way you want to go. I think you'd be able to create a much more rich world that way, because then you're allowing the option to just enjoy the story, or you can explore more and get more out of the world.
I think we're looping our arguments here.
No, I don't think so. I think maybe to a certain degree, but yeah, Zeo, I'm gonna say you're right. The story, because Final Fantasy VII, absolutely fantastic example for this podcast here. I think, yeah, its story wouldn't have, if there were player choice in it, its story wouldn't have been as strong. And there's a lot of things that happen in the game that maybe you wouldn't have experienced in it. It wouldn't have been the same.
And actually, there are some choices in Final Fantasy VII you can make that make the story play out slightly differently. Ultimately, it goes down the same path, but you can have different things happen at different points based on the interactions that you take.
That doesn't change the narrative.
Case in point, the Golden Saucer. You can go on a date with frickin' Barrett, but that doesn't change the overall narrative. Your relationship with him doesn't change. It's just an amusing moment, and then, okay, let's move on.
Yeah, so that's essentially just a side quest then.
Yeah.
I think, thinking on that, I think I finally figured out how to state my opinion on this.
Okay.
Games with too much freedom of choice are definitely limited in scope on what they can do with the narrative. Any MMO is a prime example of that. Skyrim, the Fallout franchise in recent years is an example of that. But games where the developers actually take the time to balance it, instead of just saying, how big of a world can we make and fill up with all this stuff for people to do that has no real meaning. If you get down, knuckle in, and say, I want to tell stories, I'm telling this story. Well, what if they make a different what if they want to make a different choice? Okay, that can lead to this story. And they branch it out with care. That has a lot better chance of telling a good narrative.
Okay.
So it's when the developers get too bogged down on how big can we make it that it really, really suffers.
Okay.
And that's why I wanted to focus in on player choice and what debate we're going to have. And that's what I think, like, creating choices to change the story and the narrative, that makes it better. But you have examples like the Dark Souls series where you have choices to go certain routes and you meet certain characters, and like there's lore within why these characters. Like one example is in Dark Souls 1. There's a big boss, and you can go in, you get the health bar meter, and then the battle music comes on, but he doesn't do anything. He just stares at something, and if you can go and attack him, and then he'll beat the shit out of you. But if you just sit there in the room, you find out nothing's happening. But if you pay attention, you look, he's looking at a corpse with like a dress or whatever on it. And you can look at that corpse too, and you can loot it and get items from it. But once you do that, he gets furious and starts attacking you. That's a choice you can make. Like, you didn't have to do that. The reason is because, that was his mother, and you just looted his mother's corpse. So like, that's why I wanted to define like what type of choice we had to argue, because there's obviously very different choices you can make in different types of games. Player's choice is different from changing the narrative by like, do you like red or blue?
That actually reminds me of a very amusing one. What was it?
Before
Far Cry 4?
You jump over to that, just so while we're still on this topic here. So Zeo, in that situation there, that choice, right? That player choice, do you feel that added or took away from the narrative?
That I would say added, because it wasn't a choice that took you out of the game and it didn't change the story. It's just an extra little bit of lore. And that's why I said we had to create a precedent of like what we're going to argue for. Because that doesn't change the narrative. The ending's still the same. The story structure is still the same. It's just a moderate minor choice that adds to the experience. Okay. That was different than what I was saying, as opposed to Mass Effect, when you had to choose who gets to die, who you had to sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I wanted to define what player choice was, because there are great examples of where you can make choices like that make games better for you.
Far Cry 4, I think it was.
That's a great game.
At the beginning of it, you're told, wait here a moment while I go see what's going on.
Yes.
If you actually wait, the story stops there. He comes back and you finish your diplomatic mission and the credits roll. 5 minutes of gameplay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really cool thing, but I don't know if I would consider that player choice.
That definitely doesn't make... Yeah. So...
That's really cool.
I was reminded of that by what he was saying with the corpse thing. If you just stand there for a minute and look.
So I just want to say I don't want to take player choice out of games. I just think that it can be fine tuned. And for me, my stance is, the reason this debate came to play is because I remember I told Spen, I don't like games where you get to make a character and then you make choices for that character. And I don't like those types of narratives, just because it's just... They feel stiff, they're generic a lot, and then like it can create good storytelling elements, but it doesn't make me feel invested or the characters are real.
I mean, that's a whole nother podcast topic on its own. So,
but I mean, that's what started this debate, right?
No, I think it's cool. But we're almost running out of time here. So, Zeo, yes or no answer? Does player choice affect the narrative? Is it good? Wow.
Want to re-ask that question?
Yeah. Does player choice in video games limit its storytelling potential? Yes or no?
Yes.
Toll, does player choice in video games limit its storytelling potential? Yes or no?
I have to say yes or no.
If you have to say yes or no,
you have a choice, Toll.
Yep.
Player's choice.
I know, and it's a difficult choice to make. I'm torn.
You're holding up our narrative here because you have to make this choice.
And I'm making you frustrated, and that's making the experience more rich and rewarding for me. Yes.
Okay. All right. So
wait a minute. What was the question? I answered that wrong.
I answered that wrong. I win.
I crossed a wire.
And Spencer, does player choice in video games limit its storytelling potential? Wow, Spencer, that's a really good question. I'm going to have to go with...
Maybe.
I'm going to have to go with... Yeah. In general, I would say that it limits its storytelling potential.
I'm saying yes with provisions.
Nope, you don't get to do that. It's only yes or no.
It has the potential to make it great.
It's only yes or no.
You don't get to do that, Toll.
You know what? You can put yes on paper, but I am recording it this way. So take what you get.
Toll has a real hard time of fully admitting when he's defeated. He always has to say, "Yeah,
oh no,
you're right."
Don't get me wrong.
But
I lost this argument, but I'm making myself very clear on my stance.
There's no winner. There's no winners or losers here on the SUNOVAGEEK podcast, because that was already established shortly after the introduction. So
I have been out debated.
Well, no, I don't think so. Because, I mean, I think in this situation, I think it's fair to say that, yes, it does limit the storytelling potential. But whether or not it makes the game more enjoyable, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. And that's
kind of subjective.
That's some people's cup of tea.
Yeah. But I think it's fair to say that in general, it does limit it.
So we've got a unanimous yes on this.
Woo! Now, going to you guys, whoever listens this far, what do you think?
Yeah, let us know what you think. If you think Zeo's a big smelly poopy face, let us know in the comments below.
But also, if you think player's choice inhibits the storytelling elements, let us know that too.
Also, the keyword in today's podcast is pineapples. So if you post a comment down below with the word pineapples, Toll will send you $5.
Yes.
But first, I need you to send me $5.
No, that's not how it works. Toll will send you $5. Okay, bye!